challenge Black Americans to wake up to your true history, because your quarrel is not with white men, okay? Wake up to who publishes these books and keeps us warring with one another. Christians versus Christians, right? Christians versus Muslims. Wake up and learn the true history of slavery, because that wasn't exactly a white men sport, okay? Jewish people were the ones that were trading us. Jewish people were in control of the slave trade.
Candace Owens is a true Christian. She is truly representing where Christianity can go. A zealous Christian is an anti-Semite. In Candace Owens, episode 283, somewhere I believe between the 25 and 30-minute mark, she refers to Ben Shapiro, the political commentator, as a snake. Well, not using the word snake, but inferring it. I want you to hold on to that as we go through this episode. It may seem like a small thing and even a casual thing, but I promise you, it's not incidental. That single word is going to become a thread, and one that when we pull on it is going to reveal a much larger and a much older pattern. So, welcome back to the Moral Compass podcast. Today we continue episode 2, part 3. Episode 2, part 2, unfortunately, is not going to be released. It's going to naturally lead to the question of why, and I will explain. Over the years, the one thing I've learned about myself is that whenever I hesitate to write or to release something, it's often going to be interpreted as procrastination, probably by people who procrastinate themselves, but that is not and has never been true of me as an older adult. What's happening is that the second half is not something I feel the timing is right on in terms of some of the information I release. So please keep in mind, the second half of episode 2 was already recorded. It is one long continuation. It was only supposed to be one episode, but it was very long. I cut it in half, and I also chose to review the information in the second half before I release it. So I move carefully, not fearfully. Morality isn't merely about being correct. Morality is about being socially responsible. So if I'm not confident that what I'm saying is going to be received properly and in the clearest, most responsible way that I am capable of offering, I would rather withhold information. Now, timing is exactly where we are now. Waiting has led me here. The timing feels almost providential to the information I wanted to provide in this section of the series, part 3, Race and Immoral Construct. Religion and politics are the two subjects we are taught never to discuss, because doing so is considered impolite. Yet, they're also the two forces that shape human thought at the deepest level. So, people understanding this started to be more vocal about their political alliances and about their religious views. So vocal, in fact, that they, they've become out of pocket, okay? People have no problem these days, at least not, at this time in world history, with discussing their religion or their politics. However, we are doing it in a very irresponsible way, in my opinion. And we should be very responsible with these things, because politics determines who governs us and how, and religion determines, guess what? Who governs us and how. Both possess the power to order society, and both are routinely led by men and women who seek to control other men and women. Now, the unreleased portion of this podcast touched on nearly every issue Candace Owens raised in episode 283, which is religion, Jews, Christians, Muslims, race, and slavery. Believe it or not. I mean, if you've been following my other podcast, you might not be surprised. Now, I don't identify as a religious person only because I don't have rites and rituals. That's how I define being religious. Someone who goes to a temple or a house of worship, someone who goes to church, for example, someone who has a prayer routine or, something that provides them with a tremendous amount of spiritual structure. I don't have that. I like to say I walk and talk with my creator, and that's to the extent of how you might consider me religious. So I do believe in God, but I'm not religious. As a God-fearing person, I can't help but wonder whether the creator allowed me to glimpse the direction that politics was heading long before it became visible to others. I knew where Mrs. Owens' trajectory was going, and I knew where the broader ideological media war was heading, and it was only a matter of time before politics was going to devolve into religion. We try to act like and believe that there's a separation between church and state here in the United States, but there isn't an ideological separation. Now, I want you to take a look at this clip from Charlie Kirk as he describes and defines who God is from a Christian's perspective.
Just a surface level belief. So then they'll go to the First Amendment, which has two parts of the First Amendment which get conflated. First of all, separation of church and state is not in the U.S. Constitution. That is a single letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1807 to the Danbury Baptist Convention in Massachusetts, assuring them that the government would not come after the church, okay, which is the opposite of what they would say. However, that was then resurrected by the Warren Court and the Burger Court in the 60s, where they said, hey, all of a sudden, we're now going to make this as if it's the Constitution. It does say in the Constitution two things, which is the Establishment Clause and the Free Expression Clause. The Establishment Clause is that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. What they were most worried about was a Presbyterian or a Anglican or a Quaker type religion taking over the federal government. Instead, it was that there is not going to be a state-run religion or a state-run government. Did you know that one of the first acts of Congress was taxpayer-funded Bible printing and distribution? Did you know that there were church services held in the Supreme Court building as late as the Jackson presidency in the 1820s? But going back to this idea of separation of church and state, and again, I could riff on this ad nauseum because it's just so ridiculous, right? Is that it's not biblical because, first, it's not biblical. It's not constitutional because you go a layer deeper. People that even say that, do you believe in separation of morality and state? Nobody does. Actually, 13 out of 13 required a declaration of faith. 9 out of 13 required you to be a Protestant, except Maryland, which was Catholic, which still required a declaration of faith. In almost every single one of the original state constitutions, Pennsylvania included, they had, I profess Lord and Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior in the original state constitutions. So you remember, we're a collection of states before that. Secondly, 55 out of 56 of the original signers of the Declaration were Bible-believing, church-attending Christians. You asked about common law. So common law is inherited from Blackstone, who was Christian. Common law is an outgrowth of the scriptures. So let's go to three principles of common law: due process and jury of your peers, wrapped into the ultimate biblical principle that you shall not favor justice if you are rich or poor, which is in Leviticus 19, right before the most famous part of Leviticus 19, which is that you should love your neighbor as yourself. But before that is that in the administration of justice, you shall not favor the rich or the poor, which is the idea of blind justice. We get that in the West, which is incorporated also in the New Testament ideal: neither slave nor Greek nor Jew, you're all one in Jesus Christ, which we get the idea of human equality. These are all biblical ideas. They're not Enlightenment ideas, which is they kind of get conflated at the time. But more importantly than that, they say that God was only mentioned 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. Well, that's a big deal, okay? Laws of nature and nature's God. The last paragraph of the Declaration reads as a prayer. It says, we appeal to the supreme judge of the universe. Who's the judge of the universe? Jesus Christ, as it says in Revelation, that Jesus will judge the earth on his throne. So in the Declaration, they were praying to Christ our Lord as a prayer very specifically.
So as you can see, it was always going to move in this direction if you were paying attention. Okay? Now, I didn't follow Charlie Kirk when he was alive, but I have seen mention of some clips of his, including that. I knew that the Black conservative would move in a Christian ideological direction as well. I am a part of some Black conservative groups, and I noticed that whenever I present information from a moral standpoint without framing it through the lens of Christianity, I'm often overlooked or even corrected or insulted. So that's something that I was keenly aware of. And so I knew Candace Owens, as a Christian, and a Catholic Christian no less, would eventually begin to frame her political allegiance, not just in the terms of America first and looking out for the greater interest of the Black community, because she believes that the Democratic Party is somehow at fault for destroying families. But I knew that these individuals believe that Christianity, if that little key element were incorporated, would be the solution to all of our moral issues. Not only that, I also understand that Jews around the world seem to think that Christianity in general is this neutral moral position where you can almost merge the two together and say, okay, the Jews have Judaism and Christianity is a better bet, at least for the Gentiles, if they're not willing to walk according to what the Torah says is the way for Gentiles or non-Jews. That term Gentile is not a pejorative. Why does the struggle for political power inevitably always devolve into race and religion? Well, because these have always been the primary tools of human control since the 15th century. As long as those in power can shape how we think, while preventing us from thinking for ourselves or thinking too deeply about who we are or who they are and what we're voting for, and even whether our inherited beliefs should be questions, our minds remain in perpetual captivity. When I launched this podcast, I had some doubts. I expected this podcast to resonate more strongly with the demographic that I'm most closely associated with. Those would be no-hides or people who consider themselves morally conscious. It didn't necessarily, and I think I'm starting to understand why. Because I'm not speaking about politics or religion or those, peripheral subjects, at least in the ways that most commentators do. They use party line slogans, talking points, and separating into teams. I was trying to address a global issue and several global issues. I was also addressing a point that rarely gets named, a silent factor that shapes our moral decision making, something we think is dead because here in the United States, the Civil War was fought, the Civil Rights Movement ended it, and we can now all move on. Race. Now, this is not the case. Race very much affects how we communicate with one another. It's not the same as saying that everyone is racist or that racism is the same as it was for our ancestors. But race and the result of racial constructs do continue to influence how we process information. You might even say that the unresolved grievances of our ancestors via the lessons we have passed down from generation to generation, or the inferiority complexes or superiority complexes we pass down from generation to generation, are lingering beneath the surface of our conversations, and they're reemerging depending on where you live in the world and whether those systems are covert or open. I recognize that these unresolved grievances are going to always be exploited by those who seek control. And this is why I take a very pedantic approach to breaking down race constructs. What race is, why we should take those constructs with a grain of salt, when they are useful, if they are ever useful, and how they are used today. And also, obviously, going to the very beginning, where they come from. Before continuing, I want to be clear about my intent, as I mentioned Candace Owens. This is not an attack on Candace Owens as a person. I am a moralist. People change. I have changed. People evolve all the time through insight. And sometimes insight and error can coexist even within the same individual. So what I am concerned about is with not being part of this political and religious machinery that is character assassination. I don't want to do that. But I do want us to focus on developing together great pattern recognition skills, okay? And again, these are specifically the patterns that operate beneath rhetoric. This brings us to the concept of a dog whistle. A dog whistle is language that appears neutral or analytical on the surface, but it actually carries a secondary message that is heard clearly by a specific audience. It allows the speaker to deny intent while activating some sort of suspicion, resentment, or even a bias. And it requires no evidence and only implication. As you observe politics, as you observe religion and religious constructs and religious leaders and how they speak, I want you to pay attention to dog whistles.
Belief that people should be able to debate, and that if you have something valid to say, if you're telling the truth, you ought to be able to explain it calmly and in detail to people who don't agree with you, and that you shouldn't immediately resort to shut up racist.
That is Charlie Kirk's true legacy, and that is Charlie Kirk's true friend, just as I was and am and will continue to fight and ask questions about who killed Charlie Kirk. And to people that are at home, I implore you to wake up to these people who believe that they are contract lords. I challenge Black Americans to wake up to your true history, because your quarrel is not with white men. Okay? Wake up to who publishes these books and keeps us warring with one another. Christians versus Christians, right? Christians versus Muslims. Wake up and learn the true history of slavery, because that wasn't exactly a white men sport, okay? Jewish people were the ones that were trading us. Jewish people were in control of the slave trade. They've buried a lot of it, but it's there, and you can find it.
Candace Owens is not merely critiquing institutions. She's singling out Jews. She doesn't frame slavery as a crime that was committed by empires, the church at large, and states across centuries. She does not center the Catholic Church's role in blessing and initiating the slave trade, but we know that this is true, and we have discussed it. Instead, she assigns primary responsibility to Jews without evidence. And she presents this not as one factor among many, but as the explanation. At the same time, she frames global conflict as Christians being turned against Muslims and Muslims being turned against Christians and Christians being turned against one another, implying that Jews are the underlying cause. This is not accidental rhetoric. It's directed at a collective. It's a narrative to assign blame. When I asked where to begin moral inquiry, when I began recording this podcast, and I decided I'm going to create this podcast, I chose the Black community as my first season's focus. Not only because I'm Black, but because I understand that Black people and Jews have historically been paired as symbols of moral corruption. I interview Jewish individuals as well, from rabbis to lay Jewish persons who either have an understanding of racial constructs as it pertained to the Bible, and with their individual experiences coming out of Christianity, being Black individuals going into Judaism, via conversion, and so on. So there's a reason I did that, because I understand that there is a historical pairing there. And I had also seen where Christian ideology would eventually head. Okay? It was never going to head toward explicit hatred. It was always going to head towards something far more insidious. It's going to be, again, the slow assignment of blame, because this is how Christianity has always worked. Jews becoming the explanation for everything perceived as corrupt, unfair, or destabilizing. We like to think of Christianity as this very moral religion of people who just want to do good in the world and do unto others as they would have another person do unto them. But the reality is that somehow the religious construct always devolves into blame and assigning blame, and historically assigning that blame to Jews. Politicians did it as well in non-Christian societies, okay, in non-Christian empires and rulers, okay? It's not, again, a simple political disagreement that's going on here. That's not what we're viewing. This is not just a gripe between Candace Owens and Ben Shapiro and an interpersonal issue. It's a theological issue. On November 24th, I publicly stated that while I profoundly disagreed with Candace Owens, her ethics, and her theology, any harm done to her would be immoral, because I believe it was around that time period she was alleging that, and it could or could not be true, I don't know, that France had a hit on her life, that the country of France had a hit on her life for speaking against the Macrons. Now, I wrote, again, in not my defense of her theology, but my defense of her humanity, I wrote on my personal page, let me read it to you. I wrote, apparently there's a hit on Candace Owens' life because of the Macrons. If this is true, sigh. I loathe that woman's lack of ethics and her unwavering devotion to ignorant, imperialistic religious views. I did not say that I loathe her as a person, but her ethics, her views. I loathe her bullying, her careless speech, and the anti-Semitic tenets of her espoused religion. Details, people, when I say things, again, I'm very intentional with my words. So someone else might just say, I might use something that I said, for example, I loathe that woman's lack of ethics and her unwavering devotion to ignorant, imperialistic religious views. And they might just mean, I loathe that woman's personality and her views. Every word that I said is what I specifically dislike. It doesn't mean that I dislike everything that she has ever done or said, but these are the things I dislike. Now, I said, if the intervention group of the National, I think it's called Gendarmerie, I don't know, GIGN, a secular non-Israeli entity for the record, believes this loudmouth deserves execution for her words, and if they had anything to do with Kirk's death, that is woefully immoral. Any defense I could have for people who dislike her will evaporate instantly, or evaporates instantly. That is because I am a moralist, and human life above all. Okay? But a supporter of hers responded by telling me that Candace is doing the Lord's work. I expect this type of a statement from a Christian. I don't expect it from someone who is also a no-hide or a moralist. And then she proceeded to tell me, dig deeper, Shara, dig deeper. As if I am failing to recognize that Candace Owens is exposing information, and so therefore I should turn a blind eye to her ethical conduct and her religion and all of the other things that I know are really lying underneath her words and actions. What they failed to understand is, again, my concern was never about whether everything Candace says is true or false. I believe that you can hold truth and fallacy at the same time. Again, genocide is always wrong. Christ is king. We see the connection. We know where this is going. Ben is not an idiot, right? Idiot is a strong word. I retract that. Ben is not unwise. I don't think his language is always ethical either. She essentially refers to him as a serpent, and she invokes Genesis. She told him, on your belly. On your belly, Ben Shapiro. Okay, so she does this. Again, pay attention. Christians are going to hear the dog whistle. She's echoing Christians and also people in the religious community. She's echoing Genesis 3:14, which says, and the Lord God said to the serpent, according to the Christian, translation, and the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all cattle and above every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go. Now, I'm not saying that the Jewish interpretation is much different. The Jewish meaning is very different. Okay? The language here matters. On your belly, Ben Shapiro. She's not just describing him as someone who is her ex-employer who has it out for her, in her opinion. She doesn't describe him as someone who is upsetting her or doesn't have the correct conservative political values in general, or someone who is, her, political enemy, but not because they have different parties, but because they maybe have different general values. No, she is demarcating a line between Christian values versus what she is assigning to him as Jewish values. She is framing him as the devil. That framing mirrors Christian scripture, specifically much of it, but go to John 8:44. It states, you, as it speaks to the Judeans, it's speaking to the Jews here in this text. Jesus is saying, you are of your father, the devil, and the desires of your father you will do. He was a murderer from the beginning and stood not in the truth because there is no truth in him, the beginning. The beginning they're referring to is the beginning of creation. And of course, Christian interpretation of the devil, they believe that the serpent referenced in Genesis is the devil. Fun fact for anyone who may not know this, that is not the Jewish interpretation or understanding. When he speaks a lie, he speaks of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. So the Jewish understanding of who the devil is, or the Torah, I should say, the Torah's interpretation of, who the serpent is more relating to man's inclination in one interpretation or one view, and in another view, it's more allegorical. In another view, it can be, man succumbing to his animal or the created, right? Something that was a creature, even if it is taken literally, a creature that is mirroring man. But it's not about using the same serpent as the example of all the references to what Jews describe as Hasatan, or if you think about how it's spelled, Ha-Satan, right? They're not the same. Jewish reference to Hasatan throughout the Jewish scriptures is not the same as its reference to the serpent. In Christian text, it is. And all throughout, there is this devil, and there's this wrestle between good and evil. The devil versus God, Satan versus God, darkness versus light. Christianity frames everything as this external dark force against God. Whereas in Judaism, the dark force is the choice you make to submit to your own evil inclinations. Though you are endowed with positive or good inclinations, the choice is yours. Very different concepts. So she refers to him essentially using Christian language as a snake. A zealous Christian, one who truly believes that unbelievers face eternal damnation, they cannot fully respect those who reject that belief. Tolerance may be possible. Kindness is possible, but respect is not. So I'm going to say this. A zealous Christian is an anti-Semite. And I want you to pay attention to what I said. I did not say a Christian is an anti-Semite. I said a zealous Christian is an anti-Semite. Moderate Christians who reinterpret the Bible, they avoid this tension because they're essentially, and if you're a Christian listening to this, I am not desiring to offend you, but truly, truly, you are not students of your theology. You could even have gone to seminary school, and I'm telling you, you got this wrong, okay? As far as what Christianity teaches. Now, there are modern views and modern interpretations of Christianity. It is the ever-evolving religion. That's why there are so many different denominations, so many different branches. You can make Christianity mean whatever you want it to mean. The character of Jesus gives a very general message. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Be good to others. Be kind to the poor. A message that actually is not original to the New Testament. It's something that can be found in the Hebrew Torah, where it says essentially that we ought to take care of the widow, take care of the orphans, do justice, walk humbly with God. These are what God requires of man. This is what God requires of man. And a fun fact is that there are two schools of thought that were going on at the time that Jesus, if he were real, would have actually been influencing this Jesus character's views. Those schools of thought that predate even the birth, if it happened, of Jesus Christ were the schools of Hillel and Shammai. Now, Hillel and Shammai were these great rabbis. They were not really in competition, but they had different focuses. Now, the question was asked, I believe, of Hillel. Essentially, both were asked to present the Torah. So, and they needed to do this on one foot, okay? So when it was Hillel's turn to present the Torah, he says, in one foot, anything, and I'm paraphrasing, you would not want done to you, do not do to others, right? He says it in different words. This is the Torah. Think about that. Now, if these are the words of rabbis, these rabbis they refer to in the Christian community as Pharisees, essentially anyone who kept and was religiously observant, keeping the laws. Well, this was the words of a rabbi who would have been considered among the Pharisees, because Hillel was an observant Jew. And also, Hillel and Shammai, they were both observant rabbis. Now, and a rabbi simply means teacher. Now, Jesus comes along and essentially echoes a message they already discuss, which means to say that Jesus is not very original in terms of who he is. But a lot of Christians, here is my point, view the Jesus Christ figure as unique for its time when he was not. In any event, Christians that reinterpret and focus only on those positive messages that Jesus speaks on, they don't invoke these other sorts of hostile attitudes that though he was a Jew, he was hostile to, if he were, and I'm not saying that he was a real historical figure, but if he were, he would have in essence been hostile to his own people. This happens today. There is this idea that because he was a Jew, he would have been aligned with the greater Jewish community, or at least the greater observant Jewish community. This is not the case then, and it is not always the case now. Okay, there are many people who defect, if you will, or turn against their own people. It happens all the time. Now, those are the kinds of Christians, however, who, when they reinterpret their Christian Bible, they're easier to get along with, but they're really not representatives of Christianity. Candace Owens is a true Christian. She is truly representing where Christianity can go if all of its scriptures are properly invoked. Now, I was not a casual Christian, but I was a Christian. I was a zealous Christian. So I wasn't one of these, more modern Christians that reinterpret what Jesus is to them. Oh, just be a good person. This is what Jesus would want you to do. There's a lot of education they need to learn as well, because Jesus is not God according to their script. But that's not what we're doing here. This is not a podcast to educate you necessarily about Christianity. This is not that type of a podcast. I'm not a polemicist per se, right? Although I will have to debunk a lot of things, because that is how I'm going to be able to communicate with the Black community about morality. But I will reference a rabbi I would suggest you listen to if you would like to understand more about the errors in the Christian religion and Christian theology. When I was a Christian, I was a very zealous Christian, okay? I was tantamount to a Catholic Jesuit. I remember watching Joan of Arc and thinking, I would do that. I would absolutely be burned at the stake for Jesus the Christ, right? Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior. Much like Paul, I was willing to be torn asunder. At least these are the stories, right? We don't know if these things are historically true, and I highly doubt them. So I understand the psychology of being a Christian from the inside. On the other hand, this is not about defending Ben Shapiro. I don't know what, if any, involvement he might have with any sort of political corruption. This is not about defending Zionism as it relates to political Zionists. This is not about defending the nation of Israel as if the secular government is incapable of going in an immoral direction. I am not one of these people who believe that being ethnically Jewish means that you are infallible, okay? However, I'm here to speak on behalf of the larger Jewish community, the majority of the inhabitants that reside in Israel, the majority of the Jewish demographic all around the world, and the Jewish community all around the world. I am here to speak also on behalf of the religion of Judaism as I studied it in depth, and I understand it. And I understand how it contrasts Christianity, and I understand the moral tenets are superior to that of Christianity. Now, Jews are consistently underestimating how much resentment can exist beneath polite Christian alliances. I see this all the time. Candace Owens is a Catholic before she is a political commentator. I mean, take a look at these images. These images are taken from her social media page. These images were adjusted or put up after she left Ben Shapiro's network. It was done out of spite, or it appears to be done out of spite. Consider this. And I'm not saying her religion is not something she believes and she just has this religion out of spite, but the timing of it, right? Remember what we discussed? Timing is everything. And so she leaves the Daily Wire and has had this up since, I think it was April of 2024. Okay, that's quite a while to have a Facebook banner not adjust when it doesn't represent a broader political landscape that you're supposed to represent, which is conservative, the conservative American movement. This is representing Christianity, and specifically Christianity through a Catholic lens. Most people would have a picture of their family if they're going to have an individual in their photos, a picture of someone they interviewed even in their banner. She has a picture of, obviously, a Catholic priest and her walking into a Catholic church. I don't know exactly what terms they would use. Now, so to make it clear, she is a political commentator after she is a Catholic. Her theology frames Jews as collectively culpable for the death of Jesus Christ. Primarily as literally the embodiment of Jesus on a cross, which is, for them, the crucifix, right? They focus essentially on his execution, or his crucifixion, whereas reinterpretive Christians focus on his resurrection. Now, yes, she has a right to critique corruption. Yes, she has a right to even her religious views, but we have to be able to understand where her views are coming from. Now, it doesn't mean that all Catholics, it's not a Catholics versus Protestant Christians, right? I want you to, let me point this out actually. Take a look at this quote from Martin Luther, the founder of the Protestant Reformation, from which all other Protestant denominations evolve. Okay, this is a quote from his book, assigning blame again to Jews. This is Protestant, the roots of Protestantism. But we like to think, Protestants like to think that this is a Catholic issue, right? Where Catholics are overtly focused, those who are religious, on the crucifixion of Jesus and who should be responsible for it, who has been responsible for this. But there are Catholics that take a reinterpretive approach because they are seasonal Catholics, right? They're not attending Mass every week. They're not studying with, smaller Catholic groups. I did participate in Catholicism for a little while. Not long enough to know all the exact terms without researching and confirming, but I remember I would go to we would go and have dinner and sit around each other's homes and have Bible studies together. And then I would go to Mass multiple times a day, sometimes, midweek. Catholics who are religious, they're not the same as namesake Catholics who go on seasons or even once a week for the sake of maintaining their tradition. They can be different. But if you are a zealous Catholic or a zealous Protestant, I'm telling you, a zealous Christian is an anti-Semite. So when she asserts collective Jewish guilt for slavery, she is crossing an obvious line, but not crossing a line that Catholicism wouldn't have co-signed. The claim, I'm not saying Catholicism today, of course, you have the mouthpieces of the Vatican who will have all of these benevolent ideas and proclaim that they are there for the children and for the people, and they believe in this and they believe in that. What they really believe and how low they're capable of going is a whole different story. Okay? Now, as far as Jewish guilt for slavery, that claim is rejected by mainstream historians, and it mirrors anti-Semitic propaganda, including the elders of the Protocols of Zion, which we discussed. Worse, it absolves her own religious institutions of their central role in creating what would devolve into racialized slavery. Now, it started as enslavement of essentially all non-Christians, with the exception of Jews, where they would essentially say that Jews were in a separate category, not because they were white per se, because Jews are not, we've discussed this, Jews come in all shades, okay? But, a lot of people have that misunderstanding, is that the Jews that a lot of people consider the representation of Judaism, which is European Jewry, is somehow the original version of Jew. And then if you want to find Black Jews, you have to go to, consider the transatlantic slave trade and who would have been sold. And that is a very complicated subject here. In fact, it might even debunk the idea that slaves that were brought to the Caribbean by and large and to America would have been Jews. This is not correct. Now, is it possible that as slavery, devolved from just being a religious division and a subjugation into a racial one, that they wouldn't then take, different tribes, Jewish tribes from Africa, and bring them over and say it's all the same? Sure. So could there be Black Americans who descend from Jews? Absolutely. But the beginning of the slave trade, they were targeting Black individuals that would not have had a Christian background, individuals that would not have had necessarily an obvious Jewish background. They would have been targeting non-Christians. So they would have presented themselves in terms that the church might refer to as pagan. So Africans are most known for what is poorly described as ancestral worship, when in reality, much of African tradition as it relates to focus on ancestors is a focus on venerating ancestors or remembering their messages and their stories and their contribution to their society. They would have been targeting those types of Africans, including also Africans, of course, with maybe more fierce, non-neutral belief systems that may even have been more challenging to society, but they were indiscriminate. If you were not a Christian, you did not make the cut. The transatlantic slave trade was a state-sponsored and a church-endorsed it was beholden to the Catholic Church, meaning they created the framework. And it was run by European empires, but we are referring to Spain, okay? We are referring to Portugal, the British Empire and French Empire and Dutch Empire, okay? That's where we get a lot of Dutch Africans, right? Through chartered companies, okay? Colonial law, shipping networks, insurance markets, plantation economies. I mean, the Catholic doctrine is what blessed the enslavement of non-Christians through papal bulls, such as, we've discussed this in previous episodes, Dum Diversus, or I like to refer to it as Dum Diversus, and Romanus Pontifex. Catholic religious orders in the United States even continue to bless and profit from the enslavement and sale of Black bodies well into the 19th century. Jews, again, who lacked state power because they were relegated to the status of witnesses. Essentially, they were the Christ killers. You should know that these are the ones that killed our Lord. These are the ones that were rejected. These are the law keepers. They have been rejected. We are taking their place. They were kept as witnesses. So how then is it that they were somehow in control of banking and financial institutions? And all of that, they could not have been according to the same documents and the same Catholic Church who instituted the slave trade to begin with. It's not historically accurate. They lacked state power. They lacked military control. They didn't have ecclesiastical authority, but they were scapegoated for crimes they did not architect. Were there possibly a small number in comparison to the larger world population of financiers and bankers and institutions that were Jewish individuals working behind the scenes? Probably much like, imagine, let's say you come into a bank, you open a bank account, you've got $10,000, but you got that $10,000 by committing a bunch of crimes. The teller doesn't know that. The institution, the banking institution, doesn't necessarily know that. Neither are we to say that these institutions are run by observant Jews, the ones who are considered the scapegoat for the crimes, okay, they did not architect. The bankers and the tellers might be, and I'm definitely not saying the majority because it's historically inaccurate. It's not possible. This is a fact. They wouldn't necessarily be a part of, right, this larger network, This larger network, I assure you, is predominantly Christian. Now, that is not a condemnation to modern Christians and Protestants and Catholics who reinterpret and soften Christianity and Christian theology. but it is a condemnation to the history of the church and what Christianity can devolve into if it really goes back to its roots and the meaning and the tenets of its scripture.
By the 14th century, the world already knew slavery, but it was not yet racial. In Muslim lands, slavery had operated for centuries under religious law, beginning in the 7th century as Islamic empires expanded across North Africa and the Middle East. Through the Trans-Saharan, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean routes, millions of sub-Saharan Africans were enslaved, not because they were Black, but because they were not Muslim. So they became captives of war or victims of established trade networks. This type of slavery wasn't indentured servitude. It was actually chattel slavery. Over time, however, Africans became the most accessible and expendable population, and what began as a religious distinction slowly hardened into something darker, a racial hierarchy within the Islamic world, where Muslim elites increasingly saw themselves as superior to Black Africans, even as Christianity and Islam continued to sanction human bondage. Mid-15th century, Christian Europe entered this world already shaped by Islamic slave practices. In 1441, Portuguese raids along the African coast marked the first small-scale seizure of Africans by Europeans, and this was authorized to capture non-Christians by Alfonso, I believe, V. Just a decade later, in 1452, we have Pope Nicholas V issuing Dum Diversas and authorizing Christian rulers to enslave Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ in perpetual servitude. Now, Muslims were what they refer to as Saracens, and so they were named explicitly, and for a brief time, they were captured. Some of them were captured and enslaved, but this did not last. Now, Muslim states were organized, and they operated as a unified religion. They were armed and capable of retaliation. So enslaving them proved costly. Africans, by contrast, were many different nations, many different tribes. They did not have one unified voice, so they were easier to conquer and separate because they were individually autonomous. Now, they stood outside of both Christian and Muslim power blocks. Slowly, decisively, religion, the religion of Christianity, and Islam gave way to race, and Blackness replaced unbelief as the mark of permanent enslavement. Of course, because most of the people that were African, all of the people that were African, also happened to be Black. From the 16th to the 18th century, the Atlantic system exploded into something the world had never seen: hereditary, lifelong, race-based chattel slavery. Now, it wasn't an accident of history, it was engineered. You see, Christian Europe, no longer willing to enslave Muslims and no longer restrained by theology alone, constructed a new moral logic. Africans were not just enslaved, they were redefined. So law, theology, and commerce converged to declare Black people property by birth. Meanwhile, poor whites entered the Americas as indentured servants or convicts, brutally exploited, yes, but they were never stripped of legal personhood, and they were never reduced to a permanent caste. They were just never born enslaved. Now, of course, it's in this world, already soaked in blood, hierarchy, and contradiction, that Jewish history must be understood. Jews are long accused of any of the moral corruption in our world, as just the same Blacks have become these scapegoats using pseudoscience to say these sub-Saharan tribes were less than civilized, and so therefore they should be subject to perpetual slavery, and they were not capable of refinement unless they were helped or assisted by Christian theology or, white Europeans and their customs. So Jewish people essentially had a similar battle to overcome. For centuries, Jews had lived as second-class residents in Christian Europe. They were tolerated, but restricted. So they were taxed, and the taxes, they were by different names, of course. I'm not going to get through pronouncing all these different names, but the translation would be Jew tax, right? So they had to pay Jew taxes. And they were excluded, however, from a lot of legal rights and privileges, societal privileges. But they were preserved in weakness under a theology that insisted that they needed to suffer in order to prove Christianity's truth. Now, Jewish-owned financial houses appeared as early as the 1500s, though, of course, again, they operated in a very limited framework with limited authority and abilities. They were small and fragile, mostly family-run, and they were really survival mechanisms in a society that barred Jews from land ownership and guilds and having any sort of political power. But then, in 1769, something unexpected happens. Mayor Amschel Rothschild founded a banking house that did not rely on church favor, and you heard it. He would enter the scene and blow them out of the water. Now, he didn't participate in slavery by any means. There is no recorded documentation of such. And if it had happened, it would have been documented as the church, Catholic press specifically, took a lot of liberty in framing them however they could, as being morally corrupt. Now, they didn't have any land ownership and they didn't participate in colonial plunder. You see, the Rothschilds, they didn't invent modern banking, but they revolutionized the process. So they were building international branch networks, moving in information faster than armies and financing states through bonds rather than bodies. So they owned no plantations, they enslaved no one, and participated in no slave trade. They remained openly Jewish, and that is what the Christian world did not like. They were observant to some degree and tied themselves to their community. And in doing so, they shattered an assumption older than Europe itself, that Jews were meant to remain small, dependent, and powerless because they killed the Christ. The reaction to their success was swift. In the 19th century, much of the Catholic press turned hostile, not because the Rothschilds actually committed crimes, but because their success disrupted, as I said, a moral order that had long required Jewish subordination. So the Vatican itself didn't issue any formal condemnation and often remained neutral, just as it does today, in the face of Jewish insult and persecution, except to, of course, in times of peace, make pronouncements of peace. But even as Catholic states, they became dependent on these modern banking institutions, including the Rothschilds. And of course, they didn't like that. But critics who could not understand finance in general and the success that these Jewish financiers and businessmen had, they replaced their economic savvy with fantasy. So they started to create these ideas that there were networks of cabals, right? So accounting became magic and Jewish mysticism became, some sort of Kabbalistic twist into something sinister, and these underground networks of powerful Jewish men just pulling all the strings because they needed to explain why their economies and banking networks were longer standing, but were not as successful. How were the Rothschilds literally blowing them out of the water? And from that fear was born the enduring lie that Jews or the Rothschilds ran the world. Now, by the 20th century, the myth far outlived the reality. The Rothschilds' banking empire actually fragmented after the 1930s, and they actually didn't play any central role in Zionist institutions. And that faded into the background. They faded into the background of global finance. But the myth continues. The legends continue. Today's Rothschild, dynasty, are linked to more firms that are accounts for roughly 0.01% or less of global banking assets, while banks founded in Christian majority societies control 70 to 80% of the system. Yet the legend remains because myths are always easier than history and blame is easier than reckoning. Let's blame the Jews, right? They had to be responsible for what we don't have, right? Let's blame Black people for moral corruption and not because of how we run our societies, and the lack of justice because we are allowing men to be, lynched, and we're allowing this sort of, sociopathy throughout our American systems to run rampant. And there's lots of just tons of murder and violence and decay, moral decay. But let's blame the Blacks who were literally, upon release after emancipation, they were literally just like the Jews contributing to society. but they had to be blamed and scapegoated and beaten back into submission. What people really hate the most is that, unfortunately, a lot of the infrastructures and things that were set up to kind of suppress Black success worked, right? Our families were destroyed. Infrastructures that we had set up, particularly Black Wall Street, that was destroyed by the state, right? With these false allegations because they really wanted to access oil. So many crazy things happened that just suppressed the success and the growth of the greater Black American community after emancipation. But no matter what, they could not do the same to the Jews. And let me tell you what, this pisses off Christians to no end. This pisses off ideological Christians, okay? Not fair, sane, minded Christians that are watching and waiting and going, well, I believe in Jesus, but this is pretty remarkable what the Jews are able to pull off, right? Maybe these Christians might actually see when, the Jews are rescued by their independent Messiah that has nothing to do with being some sort of a global savior. Maybe those Christians are the ones that are going to turn around to the Jews and say, oh my goodness, we see that God is with you, right? But, the super salty, bitter ones are these ideological Christians that just cannot concede to the fact that Jesus Christ did not elevate them above the Jews, because had he done that, they would not have been able to survive oppression and persecution and pogrom after pogrom after pogrom. They just don't like it. So an ideological Christian cannot accept the success, whether financial, spiritual, or moral, of the Jewish community.
Rhetoric is going to rely on suspicion, as we said, dog whistle, without any evidence. She's going to use emotion without accountability. And theology is going to be embedded subvertly into politics. Again, I am not seeking to dehumanize Candace Owens as a person, because Candace Owens is reflecting a deeper problem based on a darker system. Okay, she is not the only person that shares her views, apparently. View the comments. She's just the one she's the fall guy. But she, I assure you, represents the views of many. And the problem with a lot of people who are going on the attack to Candace is that they think, if I get rid of Candace, I'll get rid of the cancer. Candace is not the disease. She is the symptom of the disease. So I implore us all to always treat one another as human beings, okay? While at the same time we are not dehumanizing her, we're also not going to be silent in the face of this huge moral error, okay? Because silence can sometimes be complicity. Now, she presents conjecture as insight, always preserving a certain amount of plausible deniability. I didn't say exactly that. This is what I mean. She can always readjust while dog whistling to everyone around her, to the Black community, because she knows that we are sensitive to race. This is a person, again, let's not focus on Candace, but Black conservatives that take this approach. If they were to now begin to align with Candace, oh, I see where she's coming from. Oh, absolutely. It must be the Jews. This is a person, these are people who, in the face of George Floyd's death, chose judgment rather than sympathy. Now, I'm going to make something clear for everyone. I was once a Republican. And then George Floyd happened. My lifespan as a Republican, you could say, is one term, which is the election of Trump. First term, not the second, not his current term. I actually voted for Obama, much like a lot of people say. When you begin to learn about politics, right? Much like going through the journey of Christian theology and just going through a political and a theological journey, is going to mean that you are going to have to do some pass-throughs. You're going to have to decide where you land. The journey is not something you should be ashamed of. Some people were they come through different channels, but then they arrive in the same place. Everyone's journey is not the same. My husband, for example, never was an observant Christian, but he became a moralist through a more agnostic lens, believing that there may be a God. And then eventually now he's certain that there is one, but his journey wasn't through a religious landscape. some individuals' journeys out of the political madness that is Republicans versus Democrats. I'm not saying that you can't be one or the other technically, but I am saying question your allegiance entirely. Why should you say, I am a diehard Republican or a Democrat? People move through theology and politics as they learn more and they build upon their knowledge. So my political journey actually starts with Barack Obama. And of course, I start from the place that I understand most, which is that, and where I have been, what I have been taught, which is that the party of the people, the party that cares about people, are Democrats. And so for that reason, I heard the dog whistles through Barack Obama, and I'm not saying that he's all good or all bad, but I heard his dog whistles pleading to my sympathetic ear and said, I choose him over these other individuals who are so focused on policy and not people. And this is what many who are Democrats, this is their view. Empathy and sympathy over policy. Then, when I became aware that as a Democrat, I was ignoring a lot of real policies that actually do affect people. One of the major issues and primary reasons that I voted for Trump the first term is because I started investigating human trafficking. And I started realizing that there is a huge problem with human trafficking as it relates to how people enter our borders. I maintain my position on that, by the way. I believe in being responsible when it comes to vetting the people that enter a society. I do not take the hard-nosed approach, however. On a balanced other hand, I do not take a hard-nosed approach that we should indiscriminately for people who essentially utilize the loopholes in our legal system and in our borders in general to get into the country, have not committed any crimes, and may be able to even prove that they are contributing to society. Why not demand that they complete a course to confirm their understanding? Why not give them a reasonable fine of entry that they would have had to pay had they gotten through the right channels as you strengthen your borders? I don't understand the hard left and hard right approaches that we in the political landscape are so determined to take at the expense of human life. I became a little bit more aware of this important issue when it comes to policies. And so I thought the only one really taking this policy issue seriously is the Conservative Party. In addition, there were a couple other things, including the fact that, again, for me, life is above all. I don't support abortion. So I thought, which are the parties that place life, true life? And there is an emphasis a lot of times on quality of life versus actual life. So if someone's quality of life is not what a person thinks it ought to be, then we justify that they can be executed, whether it's a child that might be born with a disability or a parent who would be inconvenienced in having that. For me, we start with the primary, which is that we don't take life. From there, we build on bettering the life of a person. Democrats who say, well, all you're concerned about is ending abortion, but you're not concerned about, and I know we're getting a little into politics, but this all, trust me, this overlays with a lot of the issues in the Black community and individuals who describe it as Black and brown community, right? Where we view certain policies as callous, okay? But again, it comes to Democrats that just focus on quality of life. And I agree that we need to also, while instituting policies that say you're not allowed to take a life, we need to consider what we can do societally to improve the quality of life for individuals, whether it's providing education. I'm not necessarily saying we need to provide more material resources, but rather, teach a man to fish. If you're not able to give the man the fish, this proverbial statement. So as you follow this podcast, I hope you will start to reevaluate your language, but Black conservatives lost me to the Republican Party after George Floyd. So I remember I was starting to become very content because, again, much like Christianity, I was selective with the information that I was paying attention to when it comes to understanding politics. which most people do. Most Democrats are very selective with what they understand about what their party stands for and the policies that they institute. And most conservatives do the same. We're very selective. If it sounds good, if you hear the dog whistle, you obey. Now, for me, when I saw the image of George Floyd with the knee on his neck, my first response as a human being was, why is this necessary when this person doesn't seem to be, flailing about wildly? Common sense told me he, for some reason, didn't have the capacity to do that. This is a bigger man on site, and then we end up finding out this is a very big man.
Damn, man.
Stay in the car. Let me see your other hand.
I'm sorry.
Let me see your other hand.
Please, Ms. Officer.
Both hands.
Do nothing.
Put your fucking hands up right now. Let me see your other hand.
All right. What I do, though? What do we do?
Put your hand up there. Put your fucking hand up there. Jesus Christ. Keep your fucking hands on the wheel. Keep your fucking hands on the wheel.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry, Ms. Officer.
Who else is in the car?
I got shot. That's my friend.
Put your foot back in.
I'm sorry, Ms. Officer. I'm so sorry. God dang, man. Man, I got shot the same way, Ms. Officer, before.
Okay, well, when I say let me see your hands, you put your fucking hands up.
I'm so sorry, Ms. Officer. Take a seat. Sit down for me. Thank you, man. Thank you, Ms. Officer.
Sit down.
Thank you, man. God.
Sit all the way down.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I will. Please, man. Please, man.
You got an ID on you?
I got one at home.
All right, what's your name?
George.
George?
George Perry Floyd. I'm not knowing nothing.
Because you acting real erratic.
Man, I'm scared, man.
Let's go.
God,
You got
man.
foam around your mouth, too?
Yes. Yes, I was just moving earlier.
Let's go.
Man, what all right, let me calm down now. It's feeling a little better now.
Keep walking.
Right, okay, now, do me one favor, man.
Hey, we're going to talk about that. Let's get in the car. Stop moving around.
Man. Oh, man. I'm just a boy, man. I got anxiety. I don't want to do nothing to them.
I'll roll the window down.
Man, I'm scared as fuck, man.
You made a mistake somewhere.
When I start breathing, it's gonna go off on me, man.
Pull your legs in.
Okay. Let me count to three. And I'm going in. Please.
You can't win.
Please, I'm not trying to win. I'll get on the ground or anything.
Can we figure out what's going on?
For what?
Let's take him out and just...
For what? Please, man. I can't fucking breathe.
Here, come on out.
Look at you. Thank you.
Get him on the ground. Yeah, just get up on the ground. I appreciate that. I do.
All right.
You got your restraint? Hobble?
I can't breathe.
Okay.
I can't breathe.
Grab that.
Jesus Christ. I can't breathe.
Thank you.
I can't breathe.
Stop moving.
Follow
instructions.
Please.
Yeah, it's across the street. Park's watching.
Please.
Two other people with
Please,
him.
I can't breathe. Please, man. Please, somebody help me.
You probably step it up then.
Come on, man. I cannot breathe.
Sit there with your knee on your neck, bro. You a real man for that, bro. He ain't handcuffed, bro. You a real man.
We're gonna make a vehicle in with a tan
And we're not seeing a huge wrestle. Putting your knee on someone's neck is not how you're going to maintain control of them, which means that this person must have been easier to restrain. Why would you place pressure in an area that a person requires to breathe? And they're saying to you, or they're saying the words "ma." It's only in hindsight that people watching Candace Owens' documentary on George Floyd were able to, parse out that I guess that may have been ma or mama or whatever the name was the term or the name used to describe George Floyd's girlfriend. But prior to that information, if the empathetic region of your brain did not hear a grown man calling out to his mother, if that didn't give you pause to say, can we make sure that we lift our knee up and make sure that he's okay? He's pleading like a child, using a term we all should all invoke sympathy. Now, no one's saying that you should say, oh, get up and hands off and walk away and say, you know what, you're calling for your mom. We shouldn't do anything. You're right. No, but assess the situation. Assess. For me, that was common sense that enough assessment wasn't done. And in fact, I have more sympathy that a man was struggling to literally breathe because his heart was failing, not necessarily because of the pressure on his neck, but because his heart was failing. Either way, he wasn't wrestling and didn't require that level of restraint. This is human empathy at work here, of which I recognize she and other Republicans didn't have in the moment. So whether or not George Floyd was someone who ended up being a criminal or what have you, human beings should be treated with respect. There is the process we have in our country in the United States of, innocence until proven guilty. Even if you can immediately assign guilt to someone because you see them in the act of a crime, we need to adjust how we deal with criminality when it's not a life and death situation. We need to be more aware of the humanity of others. It doesn't matter if you're in law enforcement or any other position of authority. We need to be more human to one another. In getting back to Candace Owens, she does investigate topics that others avoid. That might be a strength. That is not something I blame her for. It deserves acknowledgement even. I respect her tenacity, her willingness to go against the grain, her willingness to not conform if she does not agree with something. But assigning blame to others without having any moral restraint is itself immoral. When men elevate their identity over, or their labels over having character, okay, which labels take minimal effort, then they need only to point and proclaim, look at me, I'm black or I'm white, so therefore I'm entitled to this or that, or therefore you should trust me. I'm Jewish or I'm Christian and therefore I should automatically be respected, or I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, you can go with whatever I say, or I'm an American. Let's stop with the labels, because they don't allow us to see what is in front of us. And they don't allow us to hear what is being said. They don't allow us to listen to the dog whistles that are disguising the truth. I'm going to leave you with this. I'm not going to dismantle every absurdity in this episode or even in this podcast, but I'm going to leave you with this to think about. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. That's a quote by Voltaire. Please subscribe to my channel. I don't publish on a schedule, so the only way to know when the next episode is released is to subscribe. I'm just Shara, and thank you for watching.